Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. So this one's gonna be a little bit different than our last episode. We're not gonna be doing a whole lot of trash talking here. We're actually gonna be doing a little bit of praising. And the topic for today, I've actually already gone over a little bit before on one of my previous videos, but for the sake of giving you guys better quality content, which I'm really trying to work on, is better audio, better visuals, something that's cleaner to watch, and just trying to work on my mannerisms in front of a camera. I want to kind of do a little bit of a redo on this one, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into specifics. So I wanted to share with you guys why I think the S550 Mustang platform is the best generation of Mustang that Ford ever built. And also, what else is the internet for than to give strangers your unsolicited takes? So that's why we're here. Appreciate you guys for watching. So let's get into it. Okay, so to start off for you guys, I want to quickly run through the Mustang generations and just very briefly kind of tell you why I don't think they're the best generation out there. So I'm gonna save generation 1 for last on that explanation. Generation 2, that one's really easy. The Mustang 2 was terrible. 4 speeds, 4 gears, 0 to 60 in 14 seconds. Not acceptable by today's standards. So that one's out. The Fox Body Mustang was really, really cool, for sure. It's definitely one of the vibiest platforms out there, and I'm sure you guys know what I mean by that. But I think the biggest problem with the Fox Body Mustang is that they were all pretty anemic. There is some really cool heritage there, but all the GTs, I think, barely coughed up over 200 horsepower. We are still kind of in the emission crisis, so compression ratios were extremely low. The Windsor V8 was not particularly powerful. And all the Fox Body Mustangs that you probably see and that you really want, at least for me, all have been Coyote swapped. Because it's just a far superior engine than to the Windsors that they were putting in those at the time. So then that leads us to the Generation 4, the SN95 Mustang. Again, these Mustangs are pretty anemic, okay? So the GTs, again, very low in the 200 horsepowers. Now there is one exception that really does make the SN95 great, specifically the New Edge era, and that was the 0304 Terminator Cobras. Those dual overhead cam, 4 valve per cylinder, 4.6 liter engines with the supercharger on them. Super, super stout blocks. They would take to 700 horsepower, 600, 700 wheel horsepower very reliably. And that, I think, is super impressive for a very early 2000s Mustang. So those 2 years of that car, they were definitely really cool. And there were some interesting things about that generation, specifically the 1999 Cobras and Cobra Rs, where the Cobras were coming up very underperforming, especially when compared to the LS1s at the time that were just released. So that was really the reason why there was no 2000 Cobra. That entire year, Ford was taking the 1999s and retuning them, and I think they threw maybe a few parts at them, but the biggest change was just a more aggressive tuning and advancing timing on those, where they would actually come up with the advertised horsepower that they were supposed to put out. So, interesting things about that generation. The Terminator, obviously really, really cool for sure, but the GTs are just very anemic. And for anybody who's wanting to buy a Mustang, make really big power, you're probably not looking at an SN95 Mustang. Okay, so then there's 3 generations left that aren't the S550. The S650, super cool, okay? Really cool. It's the newest and latest model. I have one, definitely a fantastic car. I've gone over what I think are the big issues with the S650, and actually specifically my last episode of Ship Talk, if you guys want to check that out, episode 2, but it's just not interesting enough. The problem with those cars is they're too expensive, they're not interesting, there's no Shelby model, and all the cars that are supposed to be really cool are far too expensive. They're $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 cars, and they're all the same, they're just Whipple Coyotes. And the ones I'm specifically talking about are like the RTR cars, the Hennessy car that just came out, and then like the Shelby American SSR and the GT350. So that's the problem with the S650s. They definitely have the room to become what I think is the best generation, but for right now, they just absolutely aren't. So then we get to the Generation 1 Mustang, and this is kind of a big topic. So for the Gen 1 Mustang, what I do before I make some of these videos is I'll go look up other people's opinions online. And I think I found this from Doug DeMuro, but I watched a few other videos on kind of the best generation of Mustang. So with him, and I think with a few other people, when you're rating the generations of Mustang, the first one is always the best. It's always the most important. And I think I do understand that for sure. So obviously generation 1 is Genesis for it, okay? 64.5. Now I know they only came with a 6-cylinder for the first year or the first 2 model years, but still very, very cool cars. That's where we got the GT350 from. That's where we got the GT500 from. I think that's where we got the Mach 1 from. It's definitely where we got the Boss from. So incredible amounts of heritage from the Gen 1 Mustang for sure. The reason for me why I don't think that is the best generation of Mustang to buy here in 2025 is, as cool as they are, there's extreme practicality issues with them, okay? They're obviously not modern, and with the ones that are so cool and so special, they're just extremely, extremely expensive examples. They're not a car you're really gonna daily drive. They're not a car you're really gonna go out and do track days with. They're not a car you're really gonna go do drag racing with. There are people that do that, and you absolutely can for sure. They're just gonna be very, very expensive cars. And the upkeep and maintenance to keep them in their original kind of state, I also think it's sort of withdrawing from some buyers. So, you know, if I went and bought a GT350, I would feel, and not the new, you know, the Gen 1 GT350, I would feel terrible if I started modifying that car away from its originality. Okay guys, hopefully that transition was okay. I had to restart my camera because I ran out of memory on my SD card. So I literally just ran to Office Depot to go get a new one. And good Lord, that is a depressing place to be. Anyways, using a little bit of intuition here, okay? And this is what we do on this channel. But I feel like 90 to 95% of people who are buying a Mustang are not looking at a Gen 1. So, you know, if a friend comes to you and is like, hey, I want a Mustang with some decent creature comforts, I want to make big power, or I just want to daily drive it, nobody's really recommending a Generation 1 Mustang. So I just think that car is just too special. It's too much of a rare use case for buyers out there. And I don't want to discount that car, but I guess essentially what I'm doing is sort of removing it from analysis just because it really is so special. So then we get to the S197 Mustang, and this is a really interesting kind of car for this sort of topic because I would argue the 2 best years that the Mustang has ever been produced definitely was the S197, but I don't think that it is the best generation of Mustang. And just to give you guys a quick synopsis, the reason is because I think it was plagued by too much inadequacy and badness in its lifetime. So from 2005 to 2010, you had a really bad all iron block 4-liter V6 that was anemic, and an even worse 4.6 liter 3-valve engine. Definitely a good sounding engine. I will always give the 4.6 credit for that. I definitely think it sounds better than a Coyote, but they're just not fast. Like, they were getting scraped by tuned Mazda Speed 3s back in the day, and nobody's buying a 4.6 to go make big power. Like, you could throw a supercharger at it and you'll maybe make 480 wheel. And just the problem with those cars is the heads just don't flow that well. And the compression ratio is just not as high as today's standards, especially when we're talking Gen 3 and Gen 4s. So yes, I know the 13, 14 GT500s, the GTs and the Boss 302s, probably the best Mustangs out there. I wouldn't disagree with that. But because of the first 6 years of its life, where Ford didn't have any competition with the Challenger or the Camaro, just makes that car not good enough. And that seems to be kind of a trend with Ford. If they don't have any competition, they tend to produce things that just aren't quite as good as they should be. For those reasons, that's why I don't think the S197 is the best generation of Mustang. So, okay, S550. Why I think it is the best out there. So to briefly go over the 4-cylinder and the 6-cylinder engines, for the first time in the Mustang's history, I think all engine options were very good. So obviously we'll talk about the Gen 2 Coyote here in a minute, but the 2.3 liter that they pulled from the RS, Now, to be fair, it's not fully an RS 2.3 EcoBoost. The Focus RS had a bigger turbo, a slightly stronger block design, and definitely more aggressive tuning with more boost. But the 2.3 liter that you could get in the 2015 Mustang, that was a pretty decent 4-cylinder turbo engine. They made 310 horsepower, they're relatively reliable, they're definitely good on gas, and just overall a pretty impressive non-V8 option. And I think that goes to the same for the V6. So the 3.7 liter Cyclone engine was definitely an upgrade from the old 4 liter block. Now, I know they did have the 3.7 in the S197 for a little bit, but overall, I think just a really good Mustang engine that isn't a V8. They made, I think, 300 horsepower, and which is definitely respectable for a 3.7 liter V6. You know, it's not like a hyper-tuned one that, you know, comes out of the Infinity line or anything like that. It's not a VQ, but still definitely a decent V6. So, okay, to get to the good stuff, the Generation 2 Coyote. This was the first time in the Mustang's history that you could take any Mustang GT, go throw some boost at it, and you can go make a relatively safe 700, 800 wheel horsepower. And if you want to go more than that, just throw some fueling at it, making even more power there. But the Gen 2 was definitely an improvement over the old Gen 1 Coyote that I used to have. So with that Gen 1, the problem with them is that they had rods that were on the weaker side. So around 650 horsepower, maybe 700 to the wheel on the Gen 1s was about the threshold that you could put on those before you had a catastrophic engine failure. Now, with the Roadrunner engine that was technically a Gen 1 Coyote, those ones had stronger internals, specifically the rods, and I think the pistons were a little bit stronger too. Those internals they put into the Gen 2 blocks, and that's what made them so much stronger and so much more acceptable to high levels of boost. And that to me is really cool. Now, if you threw enough boost and enough fuel at a Gen 2, people would go make 1,000 horsepower. Now, I'm not gonna say you can go make 1,000 wheel horsepower on a Gen 2 Coyote reliably, but there certainly have been instances of those cars living a relatively longish life, kind of longer than they should, but that's okay. So those Gen 2s were just really, really good. And even now with the Gen 3s and even the Gen 4s out, people will still say that those Gen 2s are king. And the reason is because you don't have to deal with the direct injection along with the port injection. Because with the Gen 3s, they went with port injection and direct injection. And the Gen 2s, you just don't really have to deal with that. Now the Gen 3s are slightly stronger in terms of their bottom end on the block, but the Gen 2s still are relatively known to be the king of boost for the Coyote platform. Now, my favorite Coyote engine is definitely going to be the Gen 3. And I think this was also a fantastic upgrade for the S550 model line between 2015 and 2023 for its entire range. So with the Gen 3s though, you had all the great benefits of the Gen 2 where you had just an extremely stout block, both the rods and the pistons and even the crankshaft, where again, you could go make a comfortable 800 wheel horsepower reliably. Anything above that though, gets a little questionable, but there's still, like I said, have been people who are making 900 to 1,000 wheel horsepower on these Gen 3 blocks, and the engine lives a relatively decent long life for what it's taking. Now, the Gen 3 also had a really cool thing with it, where for the first time ever with the Mustang, you could tune it and you're E85 ready. So this also includes flex fuel, where you could do a tune where you could throw E85 in it or 93, and it's gonna dynamically adjust how much fuel that you need from the ethanol sensors. And also too, you could just do a straight E85 tune and a straight 93 tune. So that was something I did with my Gen 3. I got it dyno tuned, I had an E85 only tune, I had a 93 only tune, and then I also had a flex fuel tune. For the majority of the life of the car that I had it, I just ran the flex fuel. It was really easy, I never had any issues with it. And it just made life super simple, not having to load up a tune every time that I'm changing fuel. So that I think is something really, really cool and also extremely valuable in an engine, to be able to tune it and to run E85. Because obviously E85 makes more power and it's a little bit easier on parts too. And just to give you guys a quick little rundown on E85, This is something I learned kind of relatively recently, but E85 is actually not a more energy dense fuel. It's actually less. Now for my guys who are running E85, obviously you use about 30% more fuel. So you're getting 30% less gas mileage. But the beauty of E85 is that fuel is actually a cooling agent for an engine. So if you can push more fuel through the engine, you're getting more cooling. And if you're getting more cooling, you can get more timing. You can advance the timing, and that's really where the big power gains are made. I say big, but relatively between 93 and 85, you're probably picking up 30, 40 horsepower, but that's pretty significant if all you're doing is tuning the car. So for a typical NA setup, people would, they'd buy a 10 or 80, get a Gen 3 Coyote, they would throw headers at it, maybe an intake, and then just do an E85 tune, and you'd be really, really fast on the strip. So really great car. Mine was the MT82 D4. This is when they actually went to the D4 from the original MT82s. Some people like the D4, some people don't. I know the gearing ratios have changed a little bit. I think when you boost the car, the gearing ratios make a lot more sense because they're stretched a little bit longer. But if you're staying NA, I think the original MT82 with the shorter gears was probably a little bit better. But overall, I think just the entire Coyote line, the Gen 2 and the Gen 3, and everything that they had to offer really made the S550 so good and so special. We're such a versatile generation of Mustang. Now again, the Gen 1 Coyote, we have to give that to the S197 for sure. But because of the weaker rods and that the Boss 302 Roadrunner engine was really the only way to get stronger internals out of a Coyote in the Generation 1, I think that's where the S550 and the Generation 2 just did it so much better. Just right out of the box, any GT model you get is gonna have an incredibly stout engine. So let's get to the special models for the S550. We've covered the 2.3 liter, the 3.7 liter Cyclone, and then the Gen 2 and the Gen 3 Coyote. So the Voodoo, the very mystical, very archaic engine that Ford produced for the S550 model year. One thing that I think is so cool about the S550 is that I can't really think of a generation of Mustang off the top of my head besides the S550 that did this. But for the first model year of that generation, Ford produced a very special Shelby model. When I think of the S197, the GT500 came out in 2007, which is 2 years after the model was debuted. We're on the S650 now, and they don't have any special cars. And I don't think the Cobra came out for the 1993, or maybe it was 1994. But either way, I don't think the Cobra car came out for the SN95 generation of Mustang. So off the top of my head, and you guys feel free, put it in the comments, correct me if I'm wrong. But off the top of my head, the S550 is the only Mustang I can think of that came out with a Shelby model for the first year. Now, I do know it was a very limited production for the GT350 in the 2015 model year. I think they produced, like 26. It was very few. And those 26 models that they did produce are very, very up in the stratosphere in terms of price because people just rate them so much higher because it's the first year. But 2016, that was, of course, obviously when the production for the Voodoo engine and the GT350s really hit hard. But that Voodoo engine is, I've said this before, and I'm gonna keep saying this, probably the vibiest engine that Ford has ever created. Now, I know it's riddled with problems. It certainly is. It has its very fair share of issues. The oil consumption, the PCB system, just overall an engine that likes to explode on itself. It just had a lot of problems. And I think because of that is why the GT350 will always be a valuable car. But as we're kind of progressing away from the production of the GT350, it's 2025, we're going into 2026. I think GT350s are probably gonna fall off for a little bit, for a little while longer through the years before they really start picking back up in price. And that's just because if you're looking for a really special track car, the GT350 is it, but you're probably gonna have some issues. For you guys that aren't super familiar with this, go online, go look at forums. I know this isn't absolute proof, it's pretty anecdotal, but go on some forums and look at people who have tracked their GT350s and just count how many engines they've been through. It's probably more than 2. And that's so unfortunate because that's what that car was made for, and it really is a track killer. And 526 horsepower, I think, is like the perfect bit for track use. If you start boosting V8s, you run into heating issues where you power soak and you go into limp mode. Looking at you, General Motors. And then really also too, anything above 500 horsepower on a track starts to become unusable unless it's really driven by expert hands. For the people who just want to get a car, have some fun, do some learning on how to drive fast on the track, I think 500 horsepower in a GT350 is just like the absolute sweet spot of where you want to be. But that car just is so special, regardless of its issues, regardless of it blowing up and consuming its own oil. The GT350 is just such a cool car. It really does have the highest vibes, and it feels so special. I've driven a few. I've never owned any. I know I've talked about owning one relatively soon on the channel, but I've definitely driven a few, and good God, do they feel so cool. I don't think quite as cool as the 01 1LE that I had, but behind the wheel of a Shelby Mustang really does feel special. And it also put in so much outside interest for that Mustang generation. People who, you know, definitely were Porsche people or BMW people, they took extreme interest in the GT350. And people who never really would look at a Mustang for a track car or even just for a daily driving car or even something just to put in their driveway, the GT350 just drew so much outside attention from markets that people generally wouldn't look over into for a Mustang that the GT500s could never do. So obviously the 13 and 14 GT500s, which I think are the best GT500s, and you should too because they're manual. But I think those GT500s, as cool as they are, they never really drew extreme attention away from people who buy Porsches and people who buy BMWs and kind of like markets like those. But the GT350 was able to do that. And to me, that's so cool and so special. So into the GT500. This is a kind of a trick pony for me. So I like the GT500, of course. The Predator engine is the absolute pinnacle of Coyote strength that was ever produced by Ford. The Gen 4 definitely isn't that. But the 5.2, obviously being Coyote architecture, the Predator engine, I think genuinely was the most practically and usably best Coyote engine ever produced. Now, my favorite is the Voodoo, and I know I keep calling Predator and Voodoo engines Coyote. They're Coyote architecture, but the Predator engine, I think, truly was the best practically usable Coyote engine. They were incredibly strong, incredibly stout cars, where people would go make 1,200 wheel horsepower, and the engines would be pretty happy there. Now, again, I don't want to say 1,200 wheel horsepower in a GT500 is reliable, specifically for the S550 GT500s, but it's definitely a relatively doable thing with some bolt-ons. It's just an engine that could take incredible amounts of power. Like, that engine reminds me of the LS9 back in the day, where the LS9 had titanium pistons, titanium rods, titanium crankshaft, where you could just go throw 1,200 horsepower at it, and it'll live there pretty, I don't want to say reliably, but pretty happily for a decent length of time. So because of all of that, every engine option was either extremely practical, extremely good, extremely stout, or extremely interesting. Not so much practical. We're looking at Voodoo engine, but because of every single engine in the entire S550 lineup throughout its 2015 to 23 year production models, I think that is what makes the S550 the best Mustang generation. And because of no other Mustang generation has done that yet, I think the S550 just sort of takes the cake on that. Now again, with the S650, the Gen 4 Coyotes, definitely really good engines, definitely very stout. They have all the advantages of the Gen 3, plus the dual throttle bodies, however you feel about those. But so far, there's just nothing special about the S650, unfortunately. We're still waiting. Hopefully Ford does something about that. I would love to see a new Shelby model in the S650, which they better put a manual in. And if they don't, I'm sending a pretty strongly worded email to them. I hope they reply to me, but I guess we'll see about that. But there you guys go. There is my take on everything in terms of generation of Mustangs that we have so far. So hopefully you guys found that interesting, maybe somewhat informative. If both, even better. But I appreciate you guys tuning into episode 3 of Shift Talk. I'm still working on trying to make my content better, trying to get better behind the camera in terms of my mannerisms and my tonality. Not trying to sound so monotone all the time. I look back at my videos and kind of cringe. But hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully you guys appreciate it. If you guys are here watching my content on my channel, that's all I could ask for. I appreciate you guys. I'm gonna give you my usual stick. Don't worry about subscribing, commenting, or liking any of my videos. If you guys wanna do so, I'd be more than honored. But if you're here enjoying my content, that's all I could ask for. So appreciate you guys tuning in, and I'll see you guys in episode 4.